Before the scar, before the prophecy, before the Dark Lord even knew his name, there was a legacy 1,000 years in the making. They weren't nobles. They weren't warlords. They were healers, protectors, quiet revolutionaries, who carried a secret more powerful than any spell. This is the true, canon story of the Potter family. The bloodline that inherited the Cloak of Invisibility, defied the darkest wizard of all time, and paid the ultimate price to protect a child destined to change the world. You've heard the story of the boy, but not the ones who came before him. If you think you know the world of Harry Potter, think again. Like the video to uncover the truth behind the legend. Because this isn't just a family history, it's the foundation of the entire wizarding world. Let's begin. In the waning light of the 12th century, when cobbled Hamlet slumbered beneath the flickering lanterns of hearth and wand, there lived a wizard known to both muggles and magical folk alike as Linfred the Potterer. Stinchcombe, a sleepy village nestled at the edge of the Gloucestershire woodlands, gave shelter to this peculiar man, a figure both genial and enigmatic, whose garden grew not cabbages, but mysteries. Linfred's cottage stood crooked and vine-strangled, perched on the lip of a gentle hill that overlooked a moss-carpeted glade. Smoke curled constantly from its chimney, carrying scents not of stew or bread, but of sage, crushed fluxweed, and something oddly metallic. Locals claimed that when the wind was right, his garden hummed with the whirring of unseen creatures and that the stones along his path whispered riddles only owls could understand. To the Muggle townsfolk, Linfred was a harmless, if eccentric, healer. A man of remedies and rubs who always had a tincture for toothaches and a cure for a croupy baby. They called him the Potterer for the hours he spent muddling in his shed with jars, flasks, and steaming cauldrons. They never knew that their ailments were treated not with poultices, but with the early forms of magical elixirs that would one day earn names etched in Hogwarts textbooks: Skeel Grow, Pepperup Potion, and Wound Cleaning Solution. But to the magical world, those few who knew to look beneath the surface, Linfred of Stinchcombe was something else entirely. He was a potioneer of extraordinary intuition, if not conventional education. Self-taught and wildly experimental, he was said to commune with his plants at dusk, coaxing them to share their secrets with the same gentle charm he used on ailing children. He spoke little at the gatherings of his kind, preferring his cauldrons to court. But his contributions to magical medicine quietly shaped the health of Britain's wizarding population for centuries to follow. More than this, however, Linfred was the founder of a name that would become legend. His experiments, many explosive, some nearly fatal, earned him a modest fortune as word of his potions spread from village to village. By the time he reached his elder years, the Potterer had accumulated not only gold but goodwill, as grateful witches and wizards from across the countryside sought his cures. Though he never patented his concoctions, the wizards of the nearby wizarding hamlet of Upper Flagley would eventually begin to reproduce his brews on a commercial scale, bringing his alchemical legacy to the wider world. It was during this twilight of his life that Linfred sired 7 children, each bright-eyed and curious, each raised beneath the smoke-stained beams of the cottage in Stinchcombe. The eldest, a thoughtful and broad-shouldered boy named Hardwin, became his father's keenest pupil. It is from Hardwin's line that the tale of the Potter family truly begins. For in a turn of fate that would bind the family name to one of the most powerful legacies in magical history, Hardwin would take as his wife a quiet, steel-eyed witch from the western hills of Godric's Hollow, a woman whose ancestry carried more than just pride or talent. Her name was Ignotus Peverell, and through her veins ran the blood of death's own deceiver. But Linfred would not live to see this union or to learn what his son would inherit. He died peacefully, seated at his garden bench, murmuring to the gillyweed that twined through his fence. It is said that when he passed, the fire in his cauldron flared green, though no one stirred it. He left behind scrolls of formulae, a locket of dried mandrake root, and the name Potter. Born from Potterer, a title once meant in jest, but carried with pride ever after. He did not know that his descendants would one day bear the Cloak of Invisibility, nor that his name would be spoken in whispers centuries later, both in fear and in awe. He only knew that healing mattered, that curiosity was sacred, and that magic, if wielded with kindness, could change the world. The year was 1224, and the winds that danced across the Gloucestershire meadows carried with them the scent of change. Hardwin Potter, now a young man of 31, stood at the crest of a ridge just beyond the fields of Stinchcombe, the wind tugging his cloak like a child pulling at a father's sleeve. He had buried Linfred 5 years earlier, and though the cottage still bore the marks of his father's mischief, singed shutters, ivy that whispered names, Hardwin had begun to carve a new legacy. He was not his father. Where Linfred was whimsical and half lost in thought, Hardwin was disciplined, methodical. Yet he bore Linfred's compassion in full, and it was this quality that would lead him to the witch who would alter the course of his family's destiny. Her name was Ignotus Peverell, and her arrival in Stinchcombe was as unassuming as the flutter of an owl's wing in fog. The Peverells were a dwindling house by then. Their surname, once spoken with the reverence reserved for royalty or ruin, had faded into folklore. Most in the magical world believed that the brothers Anch, Cadmus, and Ignotus were figures of fiction, myth-wrapped legends from the tales of Beadle the Bard. But wizards in Godric's Hollow remembered. They knew the truth, that Ignotus Peverell had not died like other men. He had vanished, shrouded beneath a cloak that defied time and death alike. Iolanthe was his granddaughter, and though she spoke little of her heritage, her eyes held the weight of it. She was not a witch of ostentation. Her magic was measured, deliberate, shaped not in wand flourishes but in quiet understanding. She came to Stinchcombe under the guise of a herbologist's apprentice, but it did not take long for word of her skill to reach the young Potter heir. Their first meeting was nothing of legend. No sparks flew, no hexes were exchanged. It was an autumn morning, and Hardwin had just returned from the border market with a parcel of dried moonlace. He found Iolanthe kneeling in his father's garden, her fingers buried in the roots of a restless titany plant. She did not look up when he spoke. "You know that one burns the skin of the careless," he said. "I'm not careless," she replied. 3 weeks later, they were married. Wizards in nearby villages murmured of the match, a union of the stolid, grounded Potter line with the haunted blood of the Peverells. But few knew the truth behind the marriage, nor the sacred gift that passed quietly from Iolanthe's hands to her husband's on the eve of their wedding. In a room lit only by wandlight, she unfolded a silvery cloth so fine it fluttered like breath and shimmered like water. It did not glow, but vanished in the light. Hardwin reached to touch it and found his hand cloaked in nothingness. "This," Iolanthe said, "is our burden now." She told him the tale, not as a bard, but as a granddaughter. Of Ignotus, the youngest of the 3 brothers who met death on a lonely road. Of his refusal to be tempted by power or resurrection. Of the cloak he accepted, and the life he lived hidden but not afraid. And of the final night, when Ignotus, aged and unbowed, cloaked himself one last time and walked into the forest, where death could no longer follow. Hardwin listened without interrupting. He did not ask for the cloak. He only asked what was expected of them. To protect it, she said. To keep it secret. And to pass it to our child when the time is right. And so the cloak of invisibility, the deathly hallow that death himself could not reclaim, passed into the Potter line. It would be hidden in trunks, behind portraits, and beneath floorboards for generations, its legend a whisper while the world focused on wands and wizards. Hardwin and Iolanthe lived modestly. They expanded the cottage, added greenhouses, and raised for children, each taught to value integrity over ambition. The cloak was never used in mischief, but in solemn practice, it covered infants during storms and elders during illness. It became a family relic, not a tool. Yet magic knows when it is needed, and the cloak would not remain hidden forever. In time, the Peverell name disappeared from records, its blood diluted, its tale dismissed. But the line lived on, in the Potters, who bore the burden without seeking the fame. And so, beneath a roof of moss and moonlight, 2 legacies twined. one of healing and one of humility, into a name that would echo into the centuries: Potter. The seasons passed, as they always do, with the slow grace of an enchanted clock. The cottage at Stinchcombe grew not in grandeur, but in presence. It became a place whispered about in both wizarding and muggle circles, a haven for the curious, the kind-hearted, and the lost. Hardwin and Iolanthe Potter lived long, though not unburdened. In each generation, the magic of the Potter line grew, not in raw power, but in clarity of purpose. They were not warriors or aurors, nor were they court wizards or professors. They were keepers, custodians of a quiet legacy wrapped in silver thread. The Cloak of Invisibility, the Hallow of Ignotus, was never spoken of outside the family. That was the pact Iolanthe made with her children before she died, her fingers still stained with moondew and belladonna root. To speak of the cloak, she warned, is to awaken the eyes of those who would steal not for need, but for glory. And so, generation by generation, the cloak passed silently from parent to child. It was not always given with joy. There were sons who feared it, daughters who rejected it, and one child who locked it in a cedar chest and fled to the continent, returning only to bury his father and unlock the secret once more. But always, it returned to the family that had vowed to keep it hidden. By the 14th century, the Potter name had scattered across Western England. Some lived in Hogsmeade, others in the valleys between Tinworth and Ottery St. Catchpole. Their lives were humble: scribes, alchemists, parchment binders, and potion sellers. But among them, one was always chosen, the bearer. It was never the eldest child, nor the brightest, but always the one who understood the difference between wielding magic and honoring it. In this era, the cloak was less an artifact than a promise. A promise that death would not be feared, that power would not be worshipped, and that some gifts were meant to be carried, not used. It was during these centuries that the legend of the Deathly Hallows began to fade into myth. The Elder Wand vanished, whispered to have passed through bloodshed and betrayal. The Resurrection Stone became a curiosity of dark wizards, rarely seen and even more rarely understood. Only the cloak remained where it had always been, in a small cottage under the care of a family too wise to boast and too proud to sell. The world around the Potters shifted. The Statute of Secrecy loomed on the horizon, drawing lines between Muggle and magical life. Wars erupted across Europe, and magical creatures fled to remote corners of the earth. Wizards began to sort themselves into bloodlines, charting ancestry like precious minerals. The Potters, once known for their skill in healing and herbcraft, were gradually overlooked by the families who sought purity over principle. And the cloak, like its keepers, disappeared from conversation. But still, it passed hands. Once, during the tenure of a quiet-browed Potter named Edric, the cloak was used to save a squib daughter from persecution in Salisbury. Edric vanished beneath the folds of the cloth, retrieved the girl from the stocks of Muggle constables, and returned her to the magical world without a trace. Another time, it was used to rescue a wounded unicorn from a poacher's trap on the outskirts of Tinworth. The poacher was never seen again, and the unicorn lived to a remarkable age. These acts were never recorded in the Prophet or in wizarding court scrolls. They were handed down in bedtime tales, whispered to children beneath thick patchwork quilts as the cloak lay folded at the foot of the bed. You are not its master, they were taught. You are its guardian. Through this code, the Potter family bound itself, not to the object, but to the idea it represented. That death could be greeted with grace. That true power was measured not by domination, but by restraint. In the 16th century, the Potters made their most difficult decision yet. When the Council of Magical Lineages began compiling the first drafts of what would later be known as the Sacred 28, lists of families considered pure by virtue of blood, the Potters refused to participate. Their reasons were both political and personal. Magic, they believed, was not a heritage, it was a gift. To measure its worth by lineage was to dilute its truth. This quiet defiance further distanced them from wizarding nobility, but the Potters did not mind. They had never sought the limelight. They sought stewardship. By the time this century faded into the next, the cloak had passed through more than a dozen hands. None ever altered it, nor tampered with it. Its edges never frayed. Its shimmer never dulled. And always, always, the promise endured. That when the time came, when the world had forgotten the Peverells and mocked the Hallows, one would rise who would need the cloak not to hide, but to walk forward, unafraid. The Potters waited. And the cloak waited with them. The 17th century crept into England like a shadow through frost-glazed hedgerows. It was a time of suspicion and silence, of whispered confessions in candlelit rooms and sudden disappearances in the dead of night. In both the magical and muggle worlds, tension curled like smoke through the alleys of London and the moors of the countryside. For wizards, the tightening noose of the impending statute of secrecy brought urgency, fear, and for some, opportunity. But not for the Potters. Their magic did not flourish in political chambers or dueling courts. It grew in greenhouses, in the flicker of potion fires, in the laughter of children raised to respect the rhythm of the earth beneath their feet. Their power was not shouted, but rooted, deep, invisible, and enduring. By this time, the family had spread beyond Stinchcombe, settling in modest wizarding hamlets along the western coast. They were rarely found in the directories of influential families, but they were known by those who mattered: wand makers, herbalists, magical historians, and occasionally, the wounded wanderers who stumbled upon a Potter doorstep in need of healing or sanctuary. One such Potter, Alric, became known across magical Cornwall as the Shadow Healer. Not for any dark art, but because he appeared when no one else would. During the devastating outbreaks of wand rot and dragon lung, magical diseases that left even St. Mungo's baffled, Alric and his siblings brewed cures in secret, delivering them cloaked and silent to families too frightened to speak above a whisper. The invisibility cloak, still in the family's possession, was used sparingly, but with precise care. Its presence during these years was whispered of, never confirmed. A ghost story among potion couriers and broomstick smugglers. A shimmer in the dark, a footfall where none should be. During this era, Rolston Potter emerged from the family's quiet tradition and did something no Potter had done for generations: he entered politics. Rolston, tall and sharp-eyed, with ink-stained cuffs and a voice that made even centaurs pause, joined the Wizengamot in the year 1612. Though his appointment raised eyebrows among pure-blood elites, many of whom viewed the Potters as quaint at best and dangerously egalitarian at worst, Rolston quickly proved himself formidable. He was a key voice during the early debates that led to the drafting of the Statute of Secrecy in 1692. Though he voted in favor of the law, believing it necessary to protect both magical and muggle communities, he fiercely advocated for protections and rights for muggleborns and squibs. He argued, publicly and at great personal risk, that wizardkind's future depended not on blood purity but on compassion and shared stewardship. Such beliefs did not win him friends among the old families. In private letters, preserved to this day in the Potter family vault at Gringotts, Rolston wrote, "They speak of magic as though it were a vault to be guarded, not a river to be shared. But the river cares not for lineage. It flows through those brave enough to stand in its current." He served until 1652, refusing 3 separate offers to ascend to Wizengamot leadership. He returned to Cornwall to teach healing magic to orphans and wandless youth until his death. Rolston left no children, but the cloak passed to his cousin, Maylis Potter, a quiet woman who wove protective enchantments into garden gates and left bread for house elves on doorsteps. The cloak was kept hidden in a cupboard behind her hearth, wrapped in linen and lavender. While the wider wizarding world obsessed over genealogy, scandal, and dueling tournaments, the Potters continued as they always had, beneath the surface. In this century, too, began the earliest formal rumblings of blood purity, driven by rising fear among pure-blood elites that the secrecy law would dilute true wizard blood. Though the Potters could trace their magical lineage back centuries, they refused to sign their names onto the manifestos of families like the Selwyns, Carrows, or Yaxleys. When asked, during a Wizengamot inquiry, why they would not support the preservation of magical heritage, Rolston famously replied, "Heritage is not worth preserving if it cannot evolve. Stagnation is not strength. It is rot." The name Potter became, in these years, a quiet symbol of resistance. Not defiance through violence or radicalism, but through integrity, humility, and service. And the cloak? It slept. Folded gently between centuries, it passed unseen through hands that did not seek greatness, but ensured it would one day be possible. For even beneath the surface, magic listens. In the vaulted, echoing halls of the Wizengamot Assembly, where purple-robed figures argued policy beneath enchanted banners and judgment hung thick as incense, Rolston Potter was an anomaly. He wore no signet rings, claimed no seat by virtue of blood, and held his tongue longer than most. But when he did speak, the chamber stilled, for Rolston had the rare power to move both mind and memory. He had been born in the year 1577, at the height of England's fevered transitions, when Muggle monarchs burned witches at the stake, or tried, and wizarding communities pulled further into their own veiled sanctuaries. Raised among herbalists and healers in the quiet valleys of Devon, Rolston had not been intended for politics. He was the son of a parchment maker and a wand polisher, and his earliest magical feats as unconventional. After a chance apprenticeship under an elderly magic historian named Theodosia Wren, Rolston took to law and magical policy like a hawk to wind. He had no patience for pomp but an unshakable reverence for truth. In 1612, his quiet scholarship and relentless logic earned him the nomination that placed him among the highest governing body of magical Britain, the Wizengamot. Rolston's first years in the chamber were stormy. He challenged established norms not with volume, but with relentless questions. Why must magical secrecy mean magical superiority? Why should a squib be denied inheritance of a family vault? Why were Muggle-born still required to register their wands upon entering Hogwarts? He was, in short, dangerous, not because he sought power, but because he reminded others of their responsibility. The debate that would define his career came in 1691, the final year before the ratification of the International Statute of Secrecy. The chamber was divided. One side saw secrecy as salvation, a way to protect magic from rising Muggle suspicion and to avoid another round of witch burnings or forced oaths. The other, led by men like Tiberius Nott, pushed for purity clauses, wand tracking by ancestry, and new definitions of magical worth. Rolston stood alone. In what would later be published as the Potter Treatise, he argued for magical secrecy as a mutual protection, not a caste system. He presented cases of Muggle and magical cooperation from Irish folklore, French medical records, and even ancient Babylonian scrolls. He emphasized that the goal was not to create a magical aristocracy, but to allow both worlds to survive without destroying one another. His speech ended with a declaration. If secrecy must be our path, let it not become our prison. We are not born to hide, we choose to do so to spare, not to separate. The statute passed, but not without compromise. Many of Rolston's proposals were buried under layers of committee edits and bureaucratic red tape. Still, his presence had altered the tone of the discourse, reminding even the most hardened purists that history had its eyes on their parchment. In private, Rolston found solace in the old ways. He returned each summer to the family's ancestral home, a modest stone manor with gnarled apple trees and a cellar filled with dusty vials. There, the invisibility cloak waited in its ancient chest, passed to him by his Aunt Maylis on her deathbed. Unlike many before him, Rolston never used the cloak. He believed it was not meant for concealment in a time of political visibility. To hide, he wrote in his journal, would be to abandon the truth. It is not death I must avoid, but silence. Yet he kept the cloak safe, warded beneath a spell of ancestral blood and ancient tongue, preserving it for the next bearer. For Rolston, the cloak was not an heirloom, it was a message. That the bearer must choose humility, not dominance. That the Hallows were never prizes, but promises. He died in 1703, his wand laid beside his favorite legal tome, his robes folded on the back of a cedar chair. He left behind no children, but his legacy passed to his younger cousin, Benedict Potter, who would one day restore the family's focus from governance back to service. The cloak passed with it, folded, silent, eternal. Rolston was buried not in the ministry's honored mausoleum, but beneath an old apple tree on the family grounds. It is said that in the spring following his death, the tree bloomed with silver leaves that shimmered only in moonlight. Some say it was the cloak's magic, honoring a bearer who had never worn it. Others believe it was simply the wind and memory, dancing one last time beneath the boughs of a man who chose truth over title. Long after Rolston Potter's final words faded from the high walls of the Wizengamot, and his writings were shelved between cobwebbed scrolls and forgotten treatises, the Potter family quietly stepped back into the life they had always preferred, one of obscurity, of stewardship, and of sacred secrecy. The Invisibility cloak, perhaps the most treasured magical heirloom in the known world, did not sit in a vault or display case. It was not studied by scholars, nor measured by wand makers, nor coveted by the powerful, because none knew it still existed. But it did. Folded in perfect silence. Following Rolston's death, the cloak passed to Benedict Potter, his younger cousin and a wandsmither's apprentice who lived a quieter life than his predecessor. Benedict was neither scholar nor orator. He was a man of hands, of wood, core, and spellcraft. His magic was personal, tactile, and ancient in the way that practical magic always is. He lived in a narrow cottage outside Ottery St. Catchpole, far from the marble corridors of the ministry, and there he raised his children with a quiet reverence for the unseen. The cloak remained in a chest beneath his bed, surrounded by simple protective enchantments and sealed with a line of poetry only his descendants would recognize. I meet death as an old friend, not a stranger. It was during this time, early in the 18th century, that the Potter family formalized their internal rite, the passing of the cloak. This ceremony was not marked by grandeur or spectacle. It was a rite of words and silence, conducted in firelight, and shared only between parent and child. Upon coming of age, or at a moment of true moral clarity, a Potterer was shown the cloak and told its origin, its burden, and the promise it carried. 3 vows were made. To never speak of the cloak outside the family. To use it not for gain, but for necessity. To pass it on only when it is understood, not merely inherited. These vows were not binding by magic, but by honor. And in the Potter family, that was enough. Over the next century, the family receded even further from public wizarding society. They avoided positions of political power, declined invitations to elite gatherings, and distanced themselves from the growing obsession with blood purity and ancestral prestige. While families like the Malfoys and Blacks began to construct vast genealogical trees and grand estates, the Potters cultivated roots, not branches. The cloak was passed from Benedict to his daughter, Thessaly Potter, a botanist and magizoologist who once saved a herd of mooncalves by cloaking their nesting ground from Muggle eyes during a rare lunar alignment. From her, it passed to Elias Potter, who lived through the Goblin rebellions and used the cloak only once, to rescue a wounded goblin child from an abandoned battlefield, despite it being considered treasonous by many. Always, the Potter who bore the cloak did so quietly, with reverence. It became not a relic, but a symbol of moral courage. It shielded lives, not egos. During the 1800s, as the wizarding world saw the rise of blood supremacy movements and complex legal debates over Muggle rights, the Potters were seldom seen in the public arena. They offered no loud protests or rousing speeches. Instead, they practiced radical empathy. They gave shelter to Muggle-borns ostracized by their families. They provided silent healing during outbreaks of cursed maladies. And they remained, as they had always been, keepers of the promise. As the Industrial Revolution transformed Muggle society, and the wizarding world scrambled to reinforce its walls of secrecy, the Potters built no fortresses. They constructed greenhouses, orangeries, and libraries, filled with records not of conquest, but of kindness. In one such record, a family grimoire passed through many generations. An anonymous ancestor wrote, "Let others build towers. We build doorways. One day, someone will need to walk through them." And still, through all this time, the cloak remained. Untouched by the centuries, it never aged, never faded. Woven from death's own gift, it defied entropy. But more than that, it waited. It waited for the time when it would not simply shield a body, but guide a soul. When it would no longer be hidden beneath floorboards, but lifted against the dark. That day was drawing closer. The wizarding world, as the 19th century waned, stood at the edge of profound change. Whispered names like Grindelwald and Dumbledore had not yet risen, but the air itself seemed charged with portent. And somewhere in the rural hills of magical Britain, the Potter line prepared, as they always had, not with might, but with memory. And a promise stitched in silver. By the dawn of the 19th century, the Potter name had become a paradox. Rarely spoken in aristocratic parlors, yet known in every corner where kindness and conviction held sway. In a world increasingly obsessed with the purity of bloodlines, the Potters represented something at once ancient and radical, a belief that the worth of a wizard lay not in ancestry, but in character. They had always walked this path, unadvertised, steadfast. But the wizarding world around them had changed. Where once pureblood pride was whispered behind fans and curtain walls, it now strutted openly in legislative halls and howled from the pages of family registries. The Sacred 28, compiled in secret during this era, catalogued those families considered untainted by Muggle ancestry. The Potters were notably absent. They had qualified, by all technical measures, tracing unbroken magical descent from Linfred of Stinchcombe to the present day. But their repeated acts of alliance, affection, and even marriage with Muggle-borns and half-bloods had earned them quiet expulsion from the pure-blood social sphere. The Potters did not contest it. Indeed, they wore their omission like a badge of honor. In the coastal hamlet of Brackenmere, where coastal fog clung to rooftops like silver lace, lived Aurelia Potter, a healer of immense skill and greater humility. Known for her dedication to Muggle-born children who had been abandoned or ostracized by their families, Aurelia was responsible for creating one of the first informal magical adoption registries. Her hearth was always lit, and her hands were always working, bandaging wounds, brewing warmth into tea, and offering safety that the world refused. She was once offered a position at St. Mungo's. She declined, noting wryly, they prefer their healing without heart. It was during Aurelia's time that the Potter family began quietly binding its grimoire pages with a new kind of enchantment and memory threads. These spells allowed ancestors' thoughts, insights, and even regrets to be passed forward across generations, not as instructions, but as invitations to understand. The first memory recorded was that of a childless Potter named Eber, who admitted he had once considered destroying the invisibility cloak out of fear of its power. His memory ends with a single whispered thought. The cloak should endure, not because it is mighty, but because it listens. Through these recollections, the family taught its descendants to resist the temptations of heritage as currency. The cloak became a tool not only of protection, but of perspective, a tangible reminder that the most precious magic is often invisible. Aurelia passed the cloak to her nephew, Justus Potter, in the final year of her life. Justus, a half-blood with a Muggle-born mother and a magical father, inherited more than the cloak. He inherited the pain of exclusion and the will to challenge it. As blood-purist ideologies tightened their grip on wizarding society, especially in continental Europe, where figures like Herbert Mulciber and Brutus Malfoy advocated for magical aristocracy, Justus wrote anonymously in the Wizarding Conscience, a radical pamphlet of the day. His essays, under the pen name Ignotus Echo, argued for magical equality, cross-blood collaboration, and a complete dismantling of blood-based registry practices. He quoted Rolston Potter in nearly every issue. Despite receiving threats, he persisted. It is said that once, returning home from a midnight rendezvous with Muggle allies in London, he was followed by 3 cloaked figures. He slipped the invisibility cloak over his shoulders and walked straight through their trap, leaving behind only a single parchment pinned to a lamppost. It read, "A name unspoken still carries weight. We walk beside you, unseen but unafraid." While his writings never achieved mainstream influence, they filtered into the hearts and minds of Muggle-born activists, secret societies of squibs, and even sympathetic ministry interns who copied the leaflets by hand. This defiance did not lead to fame. It led to silence. By the end of the century, the Potters were nearly erased from the circles of elite magical society. Their name did not appear in wedding announcements, Wizengamot proceedings, or the formal genealogies published in the annual scroll of magical lineage. They were remembered only by those who had been healed, sheltered, or saved by a cloaked figure who asked no thanks. And still, the cloak of invisibility passed on. To a new bearer. To a new generation. Waiting for the moment when it would no longer be enough to hide in the shadows, but to step forward and change the course of history. By the early 20th century, the name Potter had all but vanished from the formal conversations of wizarding aristocracy, but it had taken firm root in places far more meaningful, in whispered gratitude between healers, in records of small but miraculous magical interventions, and in the laughter of children born into a household where honor always came before heritage. But even a legacy so quietly enduring faced the threat of time. In 1903, the Potter line stood at a delicate crossroads. Henry Harry Potter, grandson of Justice and heir to the family's values, and the invisibility cloak, was the last of his branch. A man of proud bearing and sharper principle, Henry had spent his youth traveling between magical communities as both chronicler and healer, carrying on the Potter tradition of service over status. He spoke out often in the Wizengamot chambers, particularly during the First World War, when he infamously challenged the ministry's refusal to aid Muggle families affected by wizard-related skirmishes. His stance earned admiration from common witches and wizards, but ire from elite families. His name was struck from consideration in key appointments, and by the time the Sacred 28 was formally acknowledged in print, Potter was absent. Henry married late. His bride was a sharp-witted, warm-hearted witch whose family name had all but disappeared, Fleamont. Hers was a line of eccentric inventors and maverick spellcrafters, many of whom had been lost to duels, madness, or tragic experiments with time-turners and troll blood. The Fleamonts were almost mythic by the time Henry met her. Her given name is lost to most records either by design or oversight, but what endures is her dying request, spoken with fierce clarity as illness pulled her toward the veil. Let the name live on. Promise me. Give it to the child. Henry made the vow without hesitation. They had no child yet. But he promised. And years later, when his only son was born beneath a waxing moon and a sky of scattered thestral wings, he named him Fleamont Potter, a name that carried not only the memory of a fading house, but the bold, unconventional spirit that had always defined both Fleamonts and Potters alike. Young Fleamont, Monty, as his few friends would later call him, was a curious fusion of legacy and innovation. He inherited his father's resolve and his mother's ingenuity. While other children tinkered with chocolate frog cards and exploding snap, Fleamont crafted scalp treatments in the cellar and experimented with potion viscosity ratios in the rain barrels behind the greenhouse. He entered Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry in 1919 and was sorted instantly into Gryffindor. Professors noted his sharp intellect and unflappable nature, though he showed little interest in dueling or Quidditch. His passion was invention. He once turned an accidental hair-thickening charm into a prototype for what would become the foundation of his life's work, Sleeky's hair potion. After Hogwarts, he applied himself to potion development with single-minded determination. Wizards of the day mocked him for it, a glorified hair oil, they sneered, but Sleekeezes became one of the most commercially successful products in magical Britain. Its success quadrupled the already steady Potter fortune and brought wealth the family had never pursued, but now found themselves responsible for. Yet Fleamont, despite his riches, never stepped foot into the ministry nor accepted social invitations from the sacred families. He used his wealth to fund scholarships for Muggle-born students, build discreet magical hospitals, and revive endangered magical species sanctuaries. He had no interest in legacy, but kept every letter his father wrote, and every scribbled note of the woman whose name he bore. He lived simply and alone for many years until he met Euphemia, a formidable witch with a mind like a whip and a laugh like thunder. Their courtship was swift, their love undeniable. In 1959, after decades of trying and fearing the line would end, Euphemia gave birth to their only child, James Potter. A child with unruly hair, a daring smile, and a spark in his eyes that reminded Fleamont of both promise and prophecy. The boy grew quickly, bold and brilliant, clever and charismatic. And when he came of age, Fleamont fulfilled not just the Fleamont vow, but the Potter legacy. On the night before James's first journey to Hogwarts, he called him into the study, lit only by candlelight and the slow swirl of dust motes drifting like tiny ghosts through the air. He showed his son the Cloak of Invisibility, unfolding it across the oak table with hands that trembled only slightly. He told James its story, not as a tale, but as a truth. And James, wide-eyed but unafraid, whispered only one word. "Wow." Fleamont smiled. "Remember, James, it is not the cloak that makes you powerful. It is the choice to use it sparingly that makes you worthy." It was the last summer of Fleamont's life. But as he watched James vanish beneath the cloak's silver fold, the aging wizard knew that the vow had been fulfilled, the legacy continued, and the name, Potter, still held its meaning. By the end of the 1960s, the wizarding world stood on the edge of something terrible. Whispers of a rising darkness flowed through the cracks in castle walls, through firelit pub corners, and the hushed corridors of the ministry. A name, rarely spoken aloud, was gathering momentum in backroom meetings, on forbidden pamphlets, and behind one-point murders. Voldemort. But before he was terror incarnate, he was rumor. A rumor that the Potters did not ignore. Fleamont and Euphemia Potter, already aging, watched the world shift from the comfort of their modest but well-guarded home in the countryside north of Godric's Hollow. Though they had retreated from public life, they remained informed, writing to old friends, reading every page of the Daily Prophet with a practiced eye for what was left unsaid. They had seen blood-purist sentiment before. They recognized it now, wearing a new face and growing more violent. But even in the growing tension, James Potter thrived. Born in 1960, raised with love and mischief in equal measure, James had inherited more than the family fortune and the invisibility cloak. He carried the fire of the Potters who had come before him, Rolston's righteousness, Fleamont's brilliance, Aurelia's compassion, and a boldness all his own. Where his ancestors had quietly shaped history from the shadows, James was a child of Lee. Up known as the Marauders. It was a time of enchanted maps, flying mischief, secret animagus transformations, and laughter that echoed through stone hallways. But behind the joy, a darkness brewed. Even in school, the signs were there: disappearances, attacks, students whose parents suddenly withdrew them mid-term without explanation. By James's 5th year, the ministry had begun whispering about the Dark Mark. Auras were working double shifts. Entire families vanished in the night. And Voldemort's name, once a rumor, became a warning. James did not shy from it. Upon graduating, he joined the Order of the Phoenix, led by Albus Dumbledore, a resistance group of witches and wizards who understood what was coming long before the ministry admitted its scale. He had no illusions of heroism, only the belief, instilled from birth, that those with power must use it to protect, not to dominate. The invisibility cloak, once kept safe in drawers and vaults, now saw use again. not for childish adventures or schoolyard sneaking, but for war. James used it to deliver messages across enemy territory. He slipped past patrols, rescued injured allies from ambushes, and once, it was said, stood in the very atrium of the ministry while disguised Death Eaters passed inches from him, none the wiser. It was also during these years that James met Lily Evans. She was Muggle-born, brilliant, and unshakably moral. A sharp counterpoint to James's recklessness, Lily challenged him, changed him, and ultimately chose him. They married in 1979, not in grandeur, but in determination. Their wedding was attended by only those who knew the value of courage over spectacle. Fleamont and Euphemia, proud but fading, wept to see their son so bold and beloved. They did not live long enough to meet their grandson, but before they passed, both claimed by dragon pox within weeks of each other in early 1980, they handed James the full inheritance of the Potter legacy. Not just the cloak, nor the Gringotts vault filled with the fruits of Sleeky's success, but the grimoire, the memory threads, the words of Rolston, Aurelia, Justus, Benedict, Iolanthe, and Linfred. James read them all in a single night, sitting in a study now his own, the fire flickering low. He did not weep. He made one promise aloud. If I go down, I go with my wand in hand. But not before I give my son a world worth living in. Unbeknownst to him, the prophecy had already been spoken. In a shadowed room in the Hog's Head Inn, Sybil Trelawney had uttered the words that would bind his family to fate. The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches. The tide was rising. The Potters, now armed not just with courage but with legacy, stood against it. The war had begun. If there was one Potter who defied the family's tradition of silence, it was Henry Potter, known affectionately, and later infamously, as Harry. Born in 1879, Henry lived through a time of rapid transformation. The Industrial Revolution had reshaped Muggle society, and the Ministry of Magic scrambled to maintain secrecy amidst an increasingly connected, curious world. Meanwhile, the roots of magical conservatism and blood purity elitism burrowed deeper, reinforced by policy and power. But Henry Potter would not bow. Descended from Justus and inheritor of both the family fortune and the invisibility cloak, Henry stood apart in both his convictions and his courage. He was educated at Hogwarts, Gryffindor, like so many of his kin, and quickly gained notoriety for his wit, fire, and an uncanny ability to provoke even the most composed professors with questions that challenged tradition. Upon graduation, Henry became a clerk within the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. He worked diligently, making connections across all strata of magical society. He admired goblin craftsmanship, employed Muggle-born spellcrafters, and openly questioned the emerging class of ministry officials who sought to refine magical society by regulating Muggle influence. In 1913, Henry Potter was elected to the Wizengamot, following in the footsteps of his ancestor Rolston. Like Rolston, Henry did not go quietly into bureaucratic obscurity. He brought with him an uncompromising sense of fairness and a disdain for the increasingly elitist tone of the governing body. But it was the First World War that ignited the fire that would define him. Though wizards officially stayed neutral in Muggle conflicts, citing the Statute of Secrecy as their reason, Henry vehemently argued that neutrality in the face of suffering was cowardice by another name. He saw firsthand the devastation Muggle families endured, often worsened by magical interference, uncontrolled magical creatures, enchanted weaponry smuggled illegally into Muggle hands, and curses misused for profit. In a fiery Wizengamot session in 1916, he declared, "The statute was not written to excuse inaction. If we do not offer aid to the innocent, Muggle or magical, then we are not guardians of peace. We are accessories to destruction." The speech was never published in the Daily Prophet. Pressure mounted. His fellow council members, particularly those from pure-blood families such as the Selwyns and Rosiers, accused him of inciting treasonous empathy. Henry responded not with retreat, but with action. He used his personal funds to establish emergency medical outposts staffed by magical healers in Muggle towns ravaged by war. He encouraged discreet cooperation between wizarding medics and non-magical physicians. Though lauded by many in the underground resistance, his actions ultimately cost him his standing. In 1921, Henry Potter was forced to resign from the Wizengamot under pressure from conservative factions. His name was quietly removed from the minutes of key votes, and any public mentions of his proposals were redacted or buried under bureaucratic revision. The Sacred 28, formally compiled shortly thereafter, excluded the Potters. Though the official reasoning cited doubtful blood lineage, it was well understood that the real reason was political. The Potters had chosen principle over privilege, and in doing so, stepped outside the boundaries of what elite society deemed acceptable. Henry, however, did not see the loss as defeat. In the decades that followed, he returned to private life and married a woman from the obscure Fleamont family, a union that brought new blood, new name, and renewed fire into the Potter line. Their bond was one not of social strategy, but of shared vision. She, too, believed magic was a gift meant for stewardship, not dominion. Together, they raised their son Fleamont Potter with a quiet reverence for truth, instilling in him the memory of courage not often seen in history books. Fleamont would go on to preserve the Fleamont name at his mother's request, and to fulfill Henry's dream of using magic not just for discovery or defense, but for service. Henry died in 1974, his legacy mostly unspoken outside the family. Yet in private, among the dust-covered records of magical dissent and resistance, his name lingered, a faint ember in a world that had nearly snuffed out his light. In the Potter family's enchanted grimoire, bound by memory threads, his words are preserved even now. Let them call us traitors to blood. I'd rather betray blood than betray decency. Harry Potter did not bear the cloak into battle, nor wield the Elder Wand, nor seek resurrection. But in his quiet defiance, he proved that some legacies are written not in spell work, but in spine. His grandson James would remember this. And one day, so would the world. There was a time when the name Potter was uttered with cautious admiration in the gilded drawing rooms of wizarding society. Their lineage was long, their fortune respectable, and their magic, though modest, proven. But as the 20th century pressed forward, the Potters found themselves less in fashion and more in question. What began as murmurs soon grew into distance, then exile, not by spell or law, but by silence. A social shunning more brutal than any curse. At the heart of this slow, deliberate exclusion was one immutable truth: the Potters had chosen conviction over conformity. When Harry Potter stepped down from the Wizengamot, the formal mechanisms of wizarding power quietly began to erase the family's presence from official documentation. Invitations to ministry events stopped arriving. Their family crest was removed from the enchanted map in the Department of Magical Genealogy. Proposals made by Potters, regardless of merit, were shelved, ignored, or attributed to others. Even at Hogwarts, where generations of Potters had been educated and praised, subtle shifts began to take hold. The Potters did not complain. They had never sought power. They had sought purpose. Still, the effects were felt. Fleamont Potter, son of Henry, came of age during this period of erasure. He grew up watching the respect once afforded to his family quietly fade, replaced by the brittle civility of those who felt threatened by the Potters' principles. The children of pureblood elites were warned not to associate too closely. His application to work in magical law was declined without explanation. He was told, discreetly, that he should consider a more private career. So he did. He turned inward, not in retreat, but in resolve. Fleamont used the tools left to him by his forebears. A strong education, an unshakable moral compass, and the cloak of invisibility, which remained securely hidden in a magically reinforced drawer, locked by blood and truth alone. Fleamont focused on creation, not confrontation. He studied the subtle alchemy of personal care, the spellcraft behind texture, viscosity, and scent. Though mocked in wizarding circles, his work revolutionized magical grooming products. Sleeke's hair potion became a phenomenon, especially among witches who had long struggled to tame spellbent curls or windblown hex residue. Its success rebuilt the Potter fortune nearly overnight. But even then, Fleamont declined interviews. He allowed the product to speak for itself. Meanwhile, his wife Euphemia continued the family's more hidden work. She tended to magical orphans, often children of Muggleborns lost in political violence. She maintained correspondence with low-level ministry clerks who felt stifled by the growing dogma. She published, under pseudonyms, articles advocating for closer wizard-and-Muggle cooperation and magical ethics in commerce. And still, the Potters remained unwelcome at society's top tables. In 1950, when a new magical census was circulated, families were encouraged to voluntarily verify their ancestral lines. The Potters refused. Their entry in the revised registry was marked bloodline undeclared. Their punishment was not immediate, but inevitable. They were removed from the Sacred 28, the unofficial register of the most noble pureblood families. The exclusion, though unofficial and quietly executed, was deeply symbolic. It was a message, "You are not one of us." Yet to the Potters, the message was something else entirely. "You have chosen rightly." When James Potter was born in 1960, he inherited more than a name and a vault. He inherited a legacy deliberately pruned from the trees of privilege. He was raised with the stories of those who had chosen to walk away from status to protect principle. He played beneath portraits that did not smile from thrones, but from garden benches and candlelit libraries. From the time he could walk, James was told the truth. You come from people who said no when it was easier to say yes. Never forget that. By the time James attended Hogwarts, the social lines were drawn in more than blood. They were carved into dormitories and dinner tables, into the sneers of children who echoed their parents' disdain. But James, true to his name and nature, did not bow or beg. He made friends with orphans and outcasts, Remus Lupin, the werewolf, Sirius Black, the runaway heir, Peter Pettigrew, the overlooked. And always, tucked beneath his trunk, wrapped in old parchment and bound by a whisper of ancestral magic, was the Invisibility Cloak. Though he would not fully understand its weight for years, it had survived through centuries of silence, of suppression, of quiet courage. Like the Potters. And in the shadows of society's rejection, it waited, not to hide a coward, but to shield a boy who would one day carry the fate of the world. The years between the death of Fleamont and Euphemia Potter and the birth of their grandson would later be remembered by those close to the Potters as the quiet years. A period when the world held its breath, still, watchful, as if even time sensed that something great and terrible was drawing near. But to the Potters themselves, especially to James, these years were golden. After graduating from Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, James Potter carried with him not only academic accolades, but a legendary status forged through years of mischief, mastery, and unbreakable friendships. He was daring, clever, and radiantly alive. His laughter echoing through hallways long after he'd gone, his reputation equal parts troublemaker and protector. And beneath that legendary charm was something more ancient, the lineage not defined by ancestry alone, but by choice, a lineage of protectors, rebels, and quiet torchbearers who had turned from power in favor of purpose. For a few short years, James Potter lived in the full glow of youth unburdened. He and Sirius Black, now estranged from his own pureblood family, shared a modest flat in North London where enchanted ceiling fans played old wizarding wireless broadcasts and their kitchen table was perpetually littered with maps, prank plans, and order missives. Remus Lupin visited frequently, though never during the full moon. Peter Pettigrew hovered loyally, if quietly, content to remain in the wake of stronger lights. Yet amid this camaraderie and chaos, a shadow grew. Even in the golden light of those post-Hogwarts days, Lord Voldemort had begun tightening his grip on the wizarding world. At first, he was a figure from the Prophet's darker columns, a suspected radical with an unknown past. Then, a name whispered at crime scenes and burned into the skies above ruined homes. His ideology was simple and terrifying: magical supremacy, racial purity, and absolute obedience. And as his followers, the Death Eaters, grew bolder, the wizarding world trembled. The Ministry of Magic, ever slow to act, dismissed the warnings for too long. They labeled him an extremist, a fringe threat. But Dumbledore saw the truth. And so was born the Order of the Phoenix, a secret collective of witches and wizards bound by nothing but loyalty to justice and each other. James Potter joined without hesitation. He had no love for politics, no ambition for glory. But he knew when the hour had come. Trained by his parents in both charm work and cunning, James excelled in field operations, stealth reconnaissance, magical sabotage, and covert rescue missions. The invisibility cloak, now his, saw its most vital use since the days of Edric and Benedict. It no longer protected infants or mooncalves, but resistance. James infiltrated Death Eater enclaves. He helped extract Muggle-born families targeted by Voldemort's inner circle. He evaded capture a dozen times through a combination of sheer nerve, brilliance, and that shimmering gift of Ignotus. But amidst the fear, love found its way. Lily Evans, once his classmate and rival, had also joined the Order. She was everything James admired: brilliant, fierce, unwavering. Where he burned with fire, she held the calm of deep water. Their romance was not sudden, it grew slowly, irrevocably, like ivy weaving through old stone. By 1979, they married in a ceremony hidden by Fidelius' charm and witnessed only by a handful of friends. It was not a wedding of grandeur or opulence, but of legacy. Beneath an old beech tree on Potter ancestral land, with the cloak folded at the altar beside them, they bound their lives and their fates. A year later, Harry James Potter was born. He came into the world with a shock of dark hair, his mother's eyes, and a quiet solemnity that unsettled even the midwich. Fleamont and Euphemia, long gone by then, had not lived to meet him. But their memories lingered. Their portraits smiled down from the mantle. Their values whispered in the lullabies James hummed while cradling his son in the firelight. The world was growing darker. Every day, Voldemort's forces grew bolder. Hogwarts began reinforcing its wards. The Ministry, now too afraid to deny the threat, attempted half measures and propaganda while lives were lost in every corner of magical Britain. But for a little while, in those quiet years, the Potters knew peace. In the hidden valley of Godric's Hollow, where the air smelled of apples and ashwood, Lily tended the garden while James taught Harry to grip a toy broom. The cloak remained folded on a high shelf, out of reach, out of sight. But they all knew it would be needed again. Because though the world had not yet shattered, it had begun to crack. And the Potter family, keepers of a 1,000-year promise, would once again find themselves at the heart of a story written in shadow, sacrifice, and the silver shimmer of what must be protected at all cost. For a family as steeped in legacy and humility as the Potters, Fleamont was something altogether rare, a public success. He did not pursue renown, but he attracted it. He did not seek gold, but he made it, honestly, almost accidentally, with a kind of brilliance too eccentric to be deliberate and too consistent to be dismissed. Born at the turn of the century and named for his dying mother's family, Fleamont Potter entered the world bearing both the history of one line and the hopes of another. The Fleamonts, once respected pioneers in rune carving and magical metallurgy, had all but vanished from wizarding records by 1900. His mother, the last of them, made one dying request of Henry Potter. "Give him my name. Let it live." It did. And it became one of the most respected names in magical apothecary history. Fleamont's early life was quiet, bookish, and filled with concoctions. He was sorted into Gryffindor, though some professors argued he would have made a formidable Ravenclaw. He made few close friends but was well liked for his dry wit and unusual calm. Professors noted his obsession with minute magical reactions. He could spend hours stirring a solution 2 degrees leftward just to observe its memory shimmer. After Hogwarts, Rather than following his father Henry into politics or public service, Fleamont turned inward, toward potions, invention, and the uncharted intersections of vanity and alchemy. It was while experimenting with smoothing charms and demiguise hair in a rented potion cellar in Diagon Alley that Fleamont discovered the precise formula for Sleeke's hair potion. The result was revolutionary. It not only tamed the most unruly of magical hair but also imbued it with minor resistance to elemental spells, ideal for duels, social events, and formal Wizengamot appearances. The potion's appeal transcended bloodlines, ages, and fashion trends. For the first time in wizarding economic history, personal grooming became a thriving magical industry. Fleamont built the business himself, distilling, bottling, labeling, and advertising. He refused ministry licensing shortcuts and opted instead for grassroots marketing and quality over quantity. By 1937, Sleeke's was a household name. By 1945, he had quadrupled the family fortune. His commercial enterprise. But Fleamont had inherited the same quiet defiance that ran like marrow through the Potter line. He was once quoted in a private letter. "If they cannot stomach that I've earned my fortune honestly, let them choke on their inheritance." Yet beneath his accomplishments was an ever-present ache, absence. For decades, Fleamont and Euphemia, whom he married in 1929, longed for a child. Healers were consulted, potions tried, charms cast and recast. Years passed. They grew grey-haired and patient. The family fortune grew, but the house remained silent. Even the cloak of invisibility remained untouched, folded neatly in a cedar trunk, passed to Fleamont by Henry on the eve of his death, but never once worn. And then, when all hope had thinned to thread, in the spring of 1960, a miracle. James Fleamont Potter was born. His birth was more than a joy, it was a revival. Euphemia wept openly in the delivery room. Fleamont held his son for hours, whispering the names of their ancestors into the crook of James's tiny neck. It is said that the invisibility cloak stirred slightly in its trunk the night James came home, as if recognizing the arrival of its next bearer. Fleamont and Euphemia were older parents, but fiercely devoted. They poured every lesson, every tale, every thread of memory into James's upbringing. Their home was alive with love, history, and instruction. The cloak remained locked away, but James was told early of its existence, not as a trophy, but as a trust. When James turned 17, Fleamont passed it to him personally, hands trembling not with age, but reverence. "Use it wisely," he said. "Use it when others might run. Use it not to vanish, but to arrive where no one dares go." Fleamont died a few years later, followed shortly by Euphemia. Both succumbed to dragon pox, a final cruel turn in their long and noble story. But they died content, having seen their legacy carried into the bold, brilliant young man James had become. They left behind more than a vault of galleons and a storied invention. They left James with the fire of their convictions, the clarity of their love, and a family heirloom that had seen the passage of centuries and was ready for what came next. For though Fleamont was a man of potions, he knew that the future would not be healed with elixirs alone. It would take courage. And perhaps, the cloak. If Fleamont Potter was the inventor, the craftsman, the mind behind the potion that reshaped wizarding vanity, then Euphemia Potter was the soul of their legacy, the quiet, fierce, unshakable heart of the final Potter household before war would rend the world apart. Born Euphemia Roll, not of the dark-affiliated Rolls, but a distant, branchless offshoot long detached from pure-blood fanaticism, she grew up in a family of pragmatic, underappreciated witches. She had a gift for healing and a temperament as steady as starlight. Her wand, 11 inches of vinewood with a unicorn hair core, was as graceful and understated as its wielder. She met Fleamont Potter by chance, or fate, depending on how one interprets wand jewels in a crowded apothecary. He had spilled powdered bicorn horn onto her boots. She had hexed his satchel to chirp each time he lied. It took weeks before he managed a proper apology. It took even less time after that for them to realize they were bound by something ancient and rare, kindred hope. They married in 1929. Theirs was not a union of wealth or bloodline strategy. It was a marriage of principle, of warmth, and of faith that a quieter life could still leave a loud legacy. For years, Euphemia worked behind the scenes while Fleamont built sleek eases. She managed their accounts, advised on potion compliance charms, and led a discreet network of magical caregivers who tended to muggle-born children rejected by their families. She healed without recognition, taught without appointment, and nurtured a moral fire that burned in every choice the family made. But through it all, one ache remained constant. They could not conceive. For over 2 decades, Euphemia tried every healer's charm, every potion, every natural and magical remedy. She wrote to researchers, befriended mediwizards, and consulted moon cycle readers. Nothing worked. And though she bore her disappointment with poise, Fleamont saw what it cost her. She never wept in front of others. But some nights, the cloak, locked in its enchanted chest beneath their bed, would flutter ever so slightly, as if responding to the sorrow of its keeper. Then, in the spring of 1959, something changed. A quiet spell, a combination of healing runes and wandless intention. Crafted in desperation under a flowering ash tree. Whether it was luck, fate, or ancestral magic, no one could say. But that winter, Euphemia conceived. And on March 27, 1960, James Fleamont Potter entered the world, wailing and radiant, with the stormy eyes of generations and a scream that silenced even the most composed Mediwitch. Euphemia, weakened but smiling, whispered to him the first lines of the family grimoire. "You are born of fire and silver. May you walk in shadow, but never alone." She raised James with a rare blend of discipline and joy. She taught him dueling spells between biscuits. She corrected his manners while teaching him how to use the cloak's folds to muffle a laugh. She allowed him mischief, but never cruelty. And she ensured he knew not just where he came from, but why it mattered. When James first showed magical signs, levitating a kettle across the room in a fit of excitement, Euphemia wept. When he received his Hogwarts letter, she packed it in a box with her wand and a press note from Fleamont that simply read, "It begins." Euphemia passed in 1979, only a year before the war would reach her doorstep. By then, her son was a man, her husband already gone, and the cloak, once folded neatly in a cedar chest, was wrapped across James's shoulders as he vanished into the night on missions no mother should ever have to imagine. But her legacy endured. Not in fame, not in wealth, but in the way James cast his spells without hesitation. In the way he chose to fight, not flee. And in the way his son, years later, would face death itself, not with a wand, but with love, truth, and the very cloak Euphemia once stitched a patch into by hand. The sky above Godric's Hollow on the night of July 31, 1980, was clear, as if the heavens themselves held their breath. In a small, ivy-draped cottage at the edge of the village, surrounded by centuries-old trees and protected by every enchantment the Potters and the Order of the Phoenix could muster, Harry James Potter entered the world. He was born beneath candlelight, his mother's breath steady and defiant, his father's hand clutching hers like a lifeline. His first cry was sharp, piercing, a singular note that seemed to echo beyond the cottage walls, beyond the protective wards, into a world unknowingly changed. Lily Potter, her auburn hair damp with sweat, smiled through the exhaustion and cradled the child to her chest. James Potter, proud and pale with wonder, whispered his name, Harry, a quiet nod to his grandfather, and James, a name steeped in mischief and legacy. The room was small, warm, filled with the scent of lavender and old spell parchment. But it might as well have been a cathedral, for in that moment, the lineage of the Potters, all the way back to Linfred of Stinchcombe, stood unseen, bearing witness. From Ignotus Peverell, whose cloak now lay folded on a nearby chair, to Fleamont and Euphemia, whose portraits hung in the hall, every soul who had chosen silence over spectacle, principle over power, seemed to hover in the firelight. The invisibility cloak, which had passed through a dozen hands, wrapped infants, shielded healers, and saved lost creatures, now belonged to a newborn too small to hold it, but destined to wield it in ways none could yet imagine. In the days that followed, the potter's cottage became a quiet sanctuary. Lily enchanted the garden to bloom regardless of season. James constructed makeshift broomsticks from bramble and whispered to the wind that one day, his son would fly faster than all of them. They were at war, yes. Voldemort was rising. The ministry floundered. Friends vanished. Betrayals bloomed like poisonous flowers across the country. But for a few fleeting months, inside the protective charms of their hidden home, the Potters were a family. Every night, James read to Harry from a grimoire older than Hogwarts itself, substituting ancient incantations for bedtime stories. Lily sang lullabies in both English and Parseltongue, not knowing why the latter soothed the baby so completely. They laughed when he sneezed sparks. They cried when his eyes, Lily's brilliant green, locked with theirs as if seeing far beyond what his age allowed. It was a love so vast, so fierce, that the house itself seemed to hum with it. But shadows do not sleep forever. By October of that same year, the whispers had grown louder. The prophecy, spoken by Sybil Trelawney, had reached Voldemort's ears. The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches, born to those who have thrice defied him, born as the 7th month dies. 2 infants matched the prophecy, Neville Longbottom and Harry Potter. But Voldemort made his choice. The Potters, warned by Dumbledore, went into deeper hiding. A Fidelius charm was cast on their home, concealing their location from even their closest allies. The secret keeper, entrusted with their lives, was a man James called Brother. Peter Pettigrew. James placed the invisibility cloak into Dumbledore's care temporarily, for safekeeping, he said, not knowing the irony that would come. He kept only the essentials. They needed trust now. They needed protection. And so, as October waned, the leaves curling crimson and gold, Harry Potter grew within a house that waited for betrayal. His parents never told him of the danger. They sang to him, danced with him, watched him levitate toys in his crib. They loved him as fiercely as any 2 people have ever loved a child, believing, desperately, completely, that love would be enough. And perhaps, it would be. For in the moment he was born, something ancient and sacred passed through him. Not just magic, nor prophecy, but intention. A spark that came from 1,000 years of Potters choosing mercy, choosing courage, choosing not to look away. Harry Potter was not just a child. He was the echo of a lineage long underestimated, long overshadowed by louder names and darker spells. And though the world would not know it until much later, a son had been born. And the world would never be the same. Long before the lightning scar, before the curse that tore through the walls of a home cloaked in protection and love, James Potter had been known not as a father, nor even as a hero, but as a marauder. To know James in his youth was to know the brilliant fire of a boy who never walked when he could run, never whispered when he could shout, and never faced a challenge without a grin. He arrived at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry in 1971 wearing confidence like a second skin and a storm in his eyes. His name was already known to professors. His lineage ancient, his parents modestly wealthy, and his magical aptitude promising. But no one, not even Minerva McGonagall, who watched him hurl his first incantation across the Great Hall, could have predicted the legacy he would leave. Sorted, as expected, into Gryffindor, James met Sirius Black that very night, and the bond formed was instantaneous. One the golden heir of a humble but revered house, the other the rebellious scion of one of the most feared pureblood dynasties. Together, they would shake the castle walls. Soon came Remus Lupin, quiet, kind, and cursed. Then Peter Pettigrew, nervous and eager to belong. The 4 boys became inseparable, a constellation unto themselves, orbiting around shared laughter, secrets, and a growing defiance of rules that never accounted for heart. They called themselves the Marauders, and their map, a magical marvel of wand lore, cartography, and cleverness, became legend. But beyond the prankster stories and animated parchment, the name symbolized something deeper, freedom. It was a rebellion against conformity, fear, and a world slowly slipping into shadow. It was during these years that James inherited the invisibility cloak, a gift from his father, Fleamont, passed down with a gravity that momentarily stilled even James's endless energy. His father had said, "This cloak has wrapped children, soldiers, healers, and fools. Wear it with care, and never mistake hiding for cowardice." James took those words seriously. The cloak was not for petty tricks, at least, not often. He used it to sneak Remus safely to the Shrieking Shack during full moons, to scout the restricted section for forgotten hexes to protect others, to follow Death Eater's children in secret, gathering patterns long before the Order existed. But the boy was still a boy. Charismatic, arrogant at times, reckless and blind to his own privilege. Lily Evans would call him a bullying toe rag for years. And for a time, she was right. James Potter was not born wise. He was born willing to learn, to grow, to confront himself. And through the fire of self-examination, through the eyes of Lily Evans and the moral mirror of Remus Lupin, he matured. The prankster became a protector. The boy became the man. By 7th year, James was head boy, a title that shocked even Dumbledore's gargoyle. Not for academic excellence, but for leadership, loyalty, and the quiet reforms he'd begun to champion in the common room, the classroom, and between the lines of ancient rules. And with Lily? What began in rivalry bloomed into trust. She saw in him not just a brash leader, but a man who would put himself between a curse and a stranger. Who would throw aside his cloak, his wand, his name, for what was right. Their love did not erupt, it endured. Forged in moments. Long library sessions turned debates, battles fought side by side during student duels, silent nights watching the stars while others slept. When they graduated in 1978, the world outside Hogwarts was already bleeding. The name Voldemort no longer needed whispers. Death Eaters began targeting Muggle-borns. Entire families disappeared. The Ministry denied, delayed, and doubted. James and Lily chose not safety, but resistance. They joined the Order of the Phoenix, swearing oaths to fight in secret, to protect those who could not defend themselves. Sirius, Remus, and Peter followed. Their bond became more than mischief, it became a network of resistance, held together by years of trust and a single common belief. No one should face darkness alone. By 1979, James and Lily were married. Not in grandeur, but in defiance. Their vows were spoken in a garden surrounded by friends, protected by wards and wishes. Lily wore silver leaves in her hair. James wore his grandfather's wand. They danced once beneath a storm cloud that never rained. Then came the child. The prophecy. The trap. The Fidelius charm. But that was all to come. For a few short years, James Potter was not a fugitive, not a target, not a name whispered in mourning. He was the Marauders' heir, a man who carried with him the joy of rebellion, the burden of legacy, and the deepest, fiercest kind of love. And though death would take him before his son could know his voice, his laughter, or his scars, James Potter had already left behind everything his ancestors had carried forward. A cloak. A name. And the will to fight for others, even unto the last breath. When the history of the Potter family is recited in wandlit halls or whispered through the broken walls of battle-scarred ruins, it often begins and ends with their lineage, wizards, healers, bearers of an ancient cloak. But in the final, most fateful chapter of their legacy, it was not the bloodline of Peverell or the quiet power of centuries that saved their story. It was a woman named Lily Evans. Not born to the Potter name, nor to any wizarding house of grandeur or history, Lily was a Muggle-born, a child of ordinary parents in an ordinary town called Cokeworth, where the houses leaned slightly with age and magic was a story told only in bedtime books. But from the moment she first made a flower bloom with a laugh, magic knew her. And when her letter from Hogwarts arrived, delivered not by owl, but by a professor who saw her potential, her world turned. At school, Lily Evans dazzled. She was sorted into Gryffindor, though she possessed the precision of a Ravenclaw, the empathy of a Hufflepuff, and, when needed, the defiance of a Slytherin. She was bright, quick, and fiercely principled. Her spell work was elegant, her potions flawless. Teachers praised her discipline. Students trusted her with secrets they wouldn't dare admit to their closest friends. She formed a friendship early with Severus Snape, a boy from her Muggle neighborhood whose brilliance was rivaled only by his bitterness. Their bond was deep, perhaps even fated, but it was not enough to withstand the path Severus chose. And always, in the periphery, stood James Potter, loud, cocky, talented, and, in her eyes, entirely insufferable. She resisted him for years. She rejected his pranks, dismissed his flirtations, and stood between him and others when his temper flared. She saw not just the charm, but the cruelty he was capable of when he forgot who he was. And James, blessed with charm but unaccustomed to being challenged, listened. Because Lily didn't just see through him. She saw into him. By 6th year, the boy who had jinxed for amusement stood beside her to shield younger students from hexes. By 7th year, James Potter had become the kind of man Lily Evans could believe in. And in the quiet moments between classes, behind tapestries where the world could not interrupt, love grew. Not the kind found in fairy tales, but the kind forged in honesty, friction, and mutual conviction. When war came, they faced it together. They joined the Order of the Phoenix, not as idealists, but as fighters. Lily used her gifts in healing, decoding dark curses, and teaching magical defenses to those previously overlooked, Muggleborns, squibs, and fringe wizards. She became a beacon in the storm, her wand a lifeline in every raid, her mind a weapon as sharp as any spell. James once wrote of her, "She is not my light. She is the one who burns away the dark." In 1979, they were married. Their wedding was modest, wreathed in willow and moonlight, attended by those who knew the difference between legacy and loyalty. Lily wore robes of emerald green. James tucked the invisibility cloak into the folds of his coat, a silent nod to all who had come before. And then came Harry. Lily adored her son with a fierceness unmatched. She sang to him every morning, her voice weaving songs in English, Latin, and bits of Welsh she'd picked up from old magical texts. She recorded every laugh, every accidental burst of baby magic. She scolded James when he nearly dropped him practicing one-handed brooms. And all the while, the shadow drew closer. When the prophecy was revealed, Lily did not flinch. When Dumbledore warned them, she did not beg. When they were asked to go into hiding, she packed her son's bag with quiet grace, tucked a locket of her own baby hair into the seam of Harry's blanket, and cast protections so intricate they shimmered even after she walked away. It was Lily who helped design the protections around Godric's hole. To step aside. But Lily Evans, Muggleborn, mother, fighter, refused. She stood her ground and died with Harry in her arms. And in doing so, she invoked a magic deeper than wand lore, older than the Hallows. Sacrificial protection, the purest kind of enchantment. The one even Voldemort could not comprehend. That ancient, wordless magic passed into Harry's blood, carved into his very skin, and rippled through the cloak folded in Dumbledore's study, an echo that would resonate for years. Because of her, the killing curse rebounded. Because of her, the Dark Lord fell. Because of her, the Potter line endured. Lily was never a Potter by blood. But in the end, it was her love, not the cloak, not the gold, not the legacy, that made Harry the boy who lived. And for the rest of his life, whenever he touched the silver shimmer of the cloak, he would remember her hands, not trembling, but shielding. Lily of the Valley. A flower that blooms in the shade. And never bends. By 1980, the war was no longer quiet. It howled through alleyways in Diagon, left black marks in Muggle neighborhoods, tore holes in the Ministry's illusions of control. The name Voldemort, once whispered, now echoed in screams. His symbol, the dark mark, floated above homes reduced to cinders, a skull blooming green across the night sky like death's own fireworks. There were lists now. Lists of muggleborns to be watched. Of blood traitors to be silenced. Of children to be indoctrinated. And on one of those lists, circled, marked with the Dark Lord's own hand, were the names, James Potter, Lily Potter, and their infant son. The Potters had become targets. But they were not alone. The Order of the Phoenix, forged by Dumbledore's hand, stood as the last line between Voldemort and total dominance. They operated in shadows, behind false walls and coded parchments. They knew they could not win by numbers, but they could resist. Delay. Protect. Endure. James and Lily were at the heart of it. Their home in Godric's Hollow became a war room, a safe house, a temporary hospital. The sitting room had been charmed into a planning chamber. The basement, once filled with wine bottles and holiday decorations, now housed encrypted scrolls and maps of Death Eater movement. The nursery, though untouched in its warmth, was protected by more enchantments than Gringotts itself. And Harry, still a baby, watched it all with eyes far too ancient for his age. He giggled at flying teacups charmed by his father. He laughed when Sirius arrived covered in soot and triumphant from a midnight raid. He squealed at the sight of Lily's wand-like dances. But there were nights, when the fireplace crackled just wrong, when the wind shifted, that he cried without end. Something was coming. The air itself knew. By midsummer, Dumbledore revealed a truth so staggering that it shattered whatever illusions of safety remained. A prophecy had been spoken. A child born at the end of July to parents who had defied Voldemort 3 times would be the Dark Lord's downfall. The prophecy was incomplete, but Voldemort believed it pointed to Harry. There were 2 children who fit, Harry Potter and Neville Longbottom. But Voldemort chose Harry, perhaps because he was half-blood like himself. Perhaps because of a deeper magic he could not name. Whatever the reason, the Potters were marked. Dumbledore offered them the Fidelius Charm, the most complex protective spell in magical history. It would hide them completely, their location bound to the soul of a secret keeper. But it required absolute trust. They chose Peter Pettigrew. It was James's suggestion. No one would suspect him, he said. Sirius, the more obvious choice, agreed to the switch. The spell was cast. And the Potters vanished. To the world, they were gone, dissolved into smoke and rumor. To Harry, life shrunk to the size of a cottage. He grew up surrounded by books he could not yet read, photographs that moved when he slept, and parents who held each other tighter with each passing day. James spent his time maintaining the enchantments. He experimented with magical layering, redrawing protective runes across the doorposts every 3 nights. The invisibility cloak remained with Dumbledore, entrusted for broader use by the Order, a temporary sacrifice in the name of safety. Lily, ever composed, studied ancient blood magic, searching for ways to fortify Harry against a fate none could fully comprehend. She wrote daily in a journal she kept beside the crib, recording every smile, every spark of accidental magic, every whispered lullaby. He deserves a world where laughter isn't an act of rebellion, she wrote. But despite all their preparations, hope became fragile. News from outside came in bits. The Pruitts were dead. Benji Fenwick, blown apart. Marlene Kinnan and her entire family, slaughtered. The Order was dwindling. The Ministry flailed. The walls closed in. And Harry, he grew. Crawling now. Babbling. Drawing objects to him with flicks of unconscious thought. There were moments James and Lily would simply sit and watch him, as if memorizing him in case the next sunrise never came. They never said the word goodbye, not even in the worst of nights. But every glance between them said, if this is the end, let it be together. And all the while, the betrayal brewed. Peter Pettigrew, once just the nervous tag-along of the Marauders, now walked with a split soul. Lured by fear, tempted by promises, he had already handed pieces of truth to Voldemort. And though his treachery was veiled by charm and cowardice, its roots dug deeper by the day. In those final days of October, the air in Godric's Hollow shifted. Birds stopped singing. The temperature fell. And Lily, sensing something no spell could articulate, cast a final enchantment around Harry's room. Ancient, unspoken, and sealed with a mother's will. She did not know it would save the world. Only that it might save her son. The war was at their door. The shadow stretched longer. The world poised for silence. And in the heart of it all, a cottage filled with books, with love, with history, and the boy who would become legend. There are few moments in history so potent, so fragile, that their very existence bends the course of time. In the history of the Potter family, centuries long, woven with wisdom, sacrifice, and silent stewardship, one such moment arrived in a small, smoky room above the Hog's Head Inn on a cold evening in 1980. Sybil Trelawney, a name that would later be dismissed, mocked, and doubted, had uttered a truth that could not be undone. She had been interviewing for a post at Hogwarts, seated across from Albus Dumbledore, when a trance seized her, not performance, but prophecy, pure and violent, pulled from a current of time deeper than memory. She said, "The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches, born to those who have thrice defied him, born as the seventh month dies." The words hung in the air, sharp as glass, fragile as breath. And in that instant, the Potter's fate was sealed. Dumbledore, shaken yet resolute, contained the moment. Only he and Severus Snape, eavesdropping behind a door not as secure as it should have been, knew the full weight of what had just been spoken. And Snape, brilliant, broken, and bound by his own obsession, carried the knowledge straight to Voldemort. From that point forward, the Dark Lord was not simply hunting power. He was hunting a child. There were two possible candidates. Neville Longbottom, born July 30th, son of celebrated aurors Frank and Alice, who had already faced Voldemort's wrath 3 times. And Harry Potter, born July 31st, son of James and Lily, likewise members of the Order, who had resisted Voldemort 3 times before the prophecy was spoken. Voldemort chose Harry. Not because of logic or strategic advantage, but because, perhaps, he saw something of himself in the half-blood boy. A reflection. A rival. A mistake to correct before it bloomed. The prophecy, however, had one final line, spoken only to Dumbledore. And either must die at the hand of the other, for neither can live while the other survives. But that line Voldemort never heard. And so began the hunt. Dumbledore told James and Lily everything. He offered them refuge. Protection. A strategy that relied not on strength, but on concealment. The Fidelius charm was proposed, and with heavy hearts and reluctant agreement, the Potters consented. Their friends gathered. Choices were made. Peter Pettigrew, small, overlooked, trusted, was named secret keeper instead of Sirius, who would have been the obvious target. It was, they all believed, the perfect deception. Meanwhile, James and Lily read it themselves. Not with escape, but with intent. James reinforced the wards. Lily studied blood magic, love magic, soul magic, anything that could turn a mother's devotion into something immortal. Their son, the child of prophecy, was not told. He was too young to understand what his existence now meant. But he felt it. The magic in the house grew thicker. The smiles more practiced. The silences more frequent. James still made Lily laugh. Lily still sang to Harry. But there was always something, unsaid, unfinished, hanging behind their eyes. They were preparing to die. And in the quiet of those final nights, the legacy of the Potters, 1,000 years old, was reduced to 2 truths. They would not run. They would not let their son face it alone. James wrote a letter to Dumbledore the night before Halloween. He never sent it. In it, he spoke of his ancestors, of Linfred and Iolanthe, of Rolston and Henry, of Fleamont and Euphemia, and how none of their wisdom had prepared him for the terror of watching a child sleep, knowing it might be for the last time. The cloak has passed through many hands, old friend, James wrote. But it has never hidden a child from fate. If we fall, make sure he rises. Lily, that same night, carved protection runes into the floorboards beneath Harry's crib, blending old Celtic sigils with charms derived from Etruscan blood wards. She knew it was desperate. She did it anyway. And all the while, Voldemort drew closer. He had the name. He had the location. He had the betrayal. Peter had spoken. And so, on the night of October 31st, 1981, beneath a full moon glinting through enchanted clouds, the prophecy moved from vision to reality. James and Lily, armed not with wands alone, but with 1,000 years of principle and the deepest love any magic could birth, stood in defiance. Not because they believed they could win, but because they would not let him take their son. There are places in the wizarding world that remember. Not in stones or bricks, but in the very air, charged, electric, vibrating with memory. Godric's Hollow is one of them. Long before a boy with a scar would be spoken of in awe, the village had been sacred ground. It was here that Godric Gryffindor was born. Here, the Peverells once walked beneath winter branches. And here, on the eve of October 31st, 1981, the final chapter of the old Potter line, so carefully tended, so fiercely protected, came to a sudden, shattering crescendo. The day began quiet. Inside the cottage at the end of the lane, James chased a giggling Harry through a sitting room littered with books and wooden brooms. Lily, ever watchful, jotted charms into the margins of an old Latin grimoire while stirring a pot of soup with a flick of her wand. Outside, the world burned. But inside, there was still laughter. James charmed a leaf to dance like a fairy across the air. Harry reached for it with outstretched hands. Lily hummed a lullaby without knowing it. They were tired. Hope-worn. But they were together. As dusk fell, the wind shifted. The protection charms on the windows gave the faintest tremor. Barely noticeable. A flicker. James noticed. He reached for his wand on instinct. And then the air snapped. He was here. Voldemort, the Dark Lord, the culmination of prophecy and fear and hatred, stepped through the final layer of the Fidelius charm. Peter Pettigrew had betrayed them. There was no warning. No dramatic arrival. No spoken curse before the door shattered inward with a blast of green light. James didn't hesitate. He turned. He shouted to Lily. He did not have his wand. Still, he stood in the doorway between Voldemort and his family. A man descended from caretakers, from potioners, from a line who had always fought in silence. Now, he shouted. Lily, take Harry. Go. His voice was the last thing Harry would hear from his father. Voldemort raised his wand. And James Potter died standing, without wand in hand, but with the full force of his lineage burning in his chest. Upstairs, Lily ran. She locked the door with spells that could not hold him. She placed Harry in his crib and stood between her child and the figure now floating up the stairs, wreathed in death and prophecy. Voldemort spoke. Cold. Mechanical. Almost gentle. Step aside. Lily begged. Not for her life, but for her son's. Take me. Not him. Again, Voldemort offered the chance. Again, Lily refused. Not Harry, please, not Harry. But she did not move. And so Lily Evans Potter, born without noble blood, raised outside the magical world, became the shield between a dark curse and the last heir of the Potter line. And when Voldemort cast Avada Kedavra, the killing curse, aimed at a baby barely a year old, it rebounded. Not because of wands. Not because of prophecy. But because of love. Old magic. Older than bloodlines. Older than death. It split Voldemort's soul. Reduced his body to ash. Left Harry with a scar. And left behind only silence. When Hagrid arrived, hours later, summoned by Dumbledore and weeping through the rain, he found the house broken. The garden fence still bloomed from Lily's spring charm. The door hung from one hinge. Inside, James lay in the hall, glasses cracked. Lily lay at the foot of the crib, her fingers still curled toward her son. Harry, untouched, reached out to Hagrid with bright green eyes. Eyes that would one day look into the face of evil and say no. The invisibility cloak, given to Dumbledore days before, was already on its way to being returned. But the Potter legacy was no longer just cloth and coin. It was now a child. And a curse broken by love. In Godric's hollow, the wind still whispers. The tree outside the ruined house leans toward the window where a crib once stood. The ground remembers. So does the world. The wizarding world awoke on the morning of November 1st, 1981, not with trumpets, but with silence. A hush rippled from the borders of Godric's Hollow to the cobbled alleys of Diagon Alley, from the foggy highlands of Scotland to the offices of the Department of Mysteries. A silence full of disbelief, of relief, and of dawning realization. Voldemort was gone. There had been no great battle. No final duel in front of the Wizengamot. He had simply vanished. Unmade. Broken. And in his place, in the ruins of a modest cottage in a forgotten village, sat a child. Harry James Potter. The story unraveled like a spell undone. In the hours following the explosion of dark magic that ended Voldemort's reign, Minerva McGonagall stood stiff-lipped outside number 4, Privet Drive, awaiting confirmation of the impossible. Sirius Black, riding the fury of grief, arrived in Godric's Hollow seconds after Hagrid, too late to protect, too shocked to breathe. The cottage was a graveyard. James, sprawled in the hall, his wand still resting where it had rolled from his outstretched hand. Lily, crumpled before Harry's crib, her expression frozen in a final act of protection. The house stank of smoke, splintered magic, and the faint copper tang of curses. And then there was Harry. Small, blinking, unmarred except for one perfect, lightning-shaped scar etched on his forehead. No one could explain it. Not even Dumbledore, whose brilliance had shaped magical lore and broken dark curses no one else dared approach. He arrived late in the evening, his face unreadable, his gaze falling upon Harry with the sorrow of a century and the burden of knowledge no one else yet possessed. He knelt at the crib, placed his hand beside the child's, whispered a name older than Hogwarts, Ignotus. Somewhere beyond time, a cloak shimmered in agreement. As the sun rose, news spread like wildfire. A baby had lived. The Dark Lord had fallen. The war was over. And Harry Potter, barely a year old, became the most famous wizard in the world. But with triumph came tragedy. The Order of the Phoenix, though victorious, was shattered. Marlene McKinnon, the Pruitts, Benji Fenwick, Dorcas Meadows, gone. The Longbottoms, soon after, would fall to a fate worse than death. Peter Pettigrew, missing, presumed dead, his finger left at the scene of an alleged Death Eater ambush. And Sirius Black, once thought Harry's godfather and dearest friend of James, was arrested mere hours later. He laughed, they said, as Auras dragged him from the wreckage, standing among 12 bodies on a Muggle street, one still warm in his hand. With Pettigrew presumed dead and Black imprisoned in Azkaban, the truth of the betrayal was buried beneath assumption and smoke. No one questioned the narrative. Except Dumbledore. But even he could not undo it. Not yet. And so, Harry was orphaned, heir to a legacy carved in sacrifice, bearer of a scar that pulsed with ancient magic, and possessor, unbeknownst to all, of the invisibility cloak, returned to Dumbledore in secret, awaiting its time. What remained of the Potters was sealed away. The family estate, ward still intact, was placed under ministry protection. The Gringotts vault remained untouched, its contents left to accrue interest in silence. The family grimoire, with its memory threads from Linfred to Fleamont, lay locked in a trunk now assigned to a vault beneath Hogwarts. And the boy, whose cry had shattered a curse designed to end him, was left, on a chilly doorstep, wrapped in a blanket of phoenix feather weave. Dumbledore's note was short. He is safe. He must be raised away from all this. Away from fame. Away from fear. One day, he will return. For now, let him be a child. And with that, the last Potter disappeared into the Muggle world. Years would pass. The wizarding world celebrated. Rebuilt. Forgot. But some things would not fade. The scar. The silence in the hollow. The legacy of a family who never bowed. And the promise buried in blood and prophecy. Neither can live while the other survives. In the ashes of war, a baby had lived. But the story was far from over. Amidst the ruins of Godric's hollow, and in the silence that followed the fall of Voldemort, not everything that mattered was lost. The Cloak of Invisibility, the most enduring of the Deathly Hallows, survived the carnage untouched, though its bearer, James Potter, had fallen without it. It had not failed him. It had simply not been there. Just days before Voldemort arrived at the doorstep of the Potter cottage, James, at Albus Dumbledore's request, had entrusted the cloak into the headmaster's hands. Dumbledore had asked only for a short time, claiming it was needed for study, though he did not share the reason. He did not tell James that the cloak was more than heirloom. That it was legend incarnate. That it was the last known artifact of Ignotus Peverell, James's ancestor, and one of 3 fabled objects that W. Erection. He did not claim ownership. He would not. For though he held the Elder Wand, unknowingly completing the fabled set for a time, he did not seek mastery. He sought only to delay fate. To protect the boy. To buy time for the world to grow ready. The cloak rested there, patient. Timeless. It had known many hands over the centuries, those of Iolanthe, Rolston, Aurelia, Henry, Fleamont, and James. Now it waited once more. Not hidden in a trunk. Not passed in ceremony. But kept in silence, its purpose not yet fulfilled. Meanwhile, Harry James Potter, unaware of the legacy hovering just beyond reach, grew up beneath the heavy, joyless roof of number 4, Privet Drive. He wore hand-me-downs. He slept in a cupboard beneath the stairs. He knew nothing of cloaks, or magic, or hallows. But the blood in his veins knew. The ancient promise that had shaped the Potter line stirred within him, quiet, but sure. The same magic that had guided generations toward selflessness and service now lay dormant, waiting for awakening. And one day, it would awaken with a letter. In the summer of 1991, on the eve of Harry's 11th birthday, Dumbledore made his move. He did not visit Harry in person, not yet. But he watched. He watched as letters were burned. He watched as Vernon Dursley boarded them on a boat to nowhere. He watched as a giant named Hagrid arrived on an island with a birthday cake and a truth that had waited a decade to be spoken aloud. "You're a wizard, Harry." It was not just the beginning of education. It was the return of legacy. And when Harry arrived at Hogwarts, stepped into the castle built by one of his ancestors' dearest friends, Godric Gryffindor, the magic of centuries folded gently around him. The hat sorted him quickly. The castle accepted him without hesitation. And in Dumbledore's office, the cloak stirred. That Christmas, the headmaster wrapped the invisibility cloak in simple parchment. There was no enchantment on the message. Just ink and honesty. "Your father left this in my possession before he died. It is time it was returned to you. Use it well." Harry opened the gift alone, in the snow-dusted halls of Hogwarts, with only the fire and the stars to bear witness. He did not know what it was. Not yet. But when he pulled the silken fabric over his shoulders, and his body vanished beneath it, the blood of Ignotus Peverell hummed in recognition. The cloak had come home. It would shield him from danger. It would carry him into darkness. It would save lives and bear witness to truths hidden for centuries. But most of all, it would remind him, again and again, of who he was. Not just the boy who lived. Not just a name in prophecy. But the final heir of a family who had never sought greatness, only goodness. A family who carried not power, but promise. And now, the cloak, and the legacy, belonged to him. The Potter name, by the time Harry reached adolescence, had all but faded into myth. To his classmates at Hogwarts, he was famous not for his ancestry, but for the scar. To the wizarding public, he was a symbol, the boy who lived, shaped more by rumor than by reality. Even he believed, for a long time, that he was alone. But magic remembers. And so does blood. The Potter line, traced back 1,000 years, was never one of loud triumph or political dominance. It had weathered tyrants, survived plagues, withdrawn from the sacred 28, and passed its wisdom through journals, not thrones. Yet now, through Harry, it stood at the edge of a second war. And still, it endured. Not through spells or fortresses, but through values passed from parent to child, woven silently through generations. Linfred, with his healing hands and gentle innovations. Iolanthe, who chose love over legacy. Rolston, who shielded Muggle villages during the Goblin rebellions. Henry, who defied the Ministry to protect Muggles during the First World War. Fleamont, who revolutionized magical commerce and gave every Canute to causes greater than himself. Euphemia, who healed in secret and gave her dying breath to raise a son for a world that needed him. And then came James and Lily, who gave not only their lives, but their choices, to fight, to love, to stay. All of that now lived in Harry. In his first year, he faced a dark echo of Voldemort and chose not power, but protection. In his second, he risked his life for a girl he barely knew. In his third, he defied the Ministry to save the man he believed to be his godfather. In his fourth, he stood alone in a graveyard and returned. In his fifth, he led an army not for glory, but because no one else would. And in his sixth, he chose truth over comfort. Every choice he made echoed the same fundamental belief passed down for centuries. Do what is right, not what is easy. The blood magic his mother left him still shielded him, hidden deep within his skin. The Cloak of Invisibility, his ancestors' final gift, still protected him. But what truly sustained him, when all else fell away, was the invisible inheritance of the Potters. Compassion. Conviction. Courage without condition. It became clearest as he approached the end. In the Forbidden Forest, one tucked away, heart steady, Harry walked to die. Not because he had no other choice, but because he chose to. He believed that some things were worth dying for. And in doing so, he fulfilled not just a prophecy, but the destiny whispered through his line for generations. He became master of death, not by claiming the Elder Wand, not by conquering death itself, but by accepting it. By understanding what Ignotus Peverell had known long ago. That the greatest power is not invisibility. Not resurrection. Not even a wand stronger than all others. It is knowing when to step forward, and when to let go. Harry survived. He won. But more importantly, he remained himself. And in that victory, the legacy of the Potters was not just preserved, it was reborn. After the war, Harry never boasted. He returned the Elder Wand to Dumbledore's tomb. He kept the cloak, yes, but never used it for selfish gain. He became a husband, a father, and a quiet man of principle. He did not seek office. He sought peace. And when his first son was born, he gave him a name forged in history. James Sirius Potter. A name not of triumph, but of love. In that child, and in those to come, the Potter legacy would continue, not with crowns, nor curses, nor titles, but with choices. With kindness. With the blood that endures. It began in Godric's Hollow. It ended there too. Years after the war had ended, after peace had settled like ash across a rebuilt world, Harry Potter returned to the village that had once held his future in its trembling hands. He came not in secrecy, not beneath cloak or cover, but openly. Older now, father at his side, children in tow. The house still stood. Not whole. Not habitable. But preserved, frozen in the moment the curse had struck. The gate still bore the carvings left by grateful strangers, faded spells of hope and sorrow etched in dozens of languages. Beneath vines and weathered runes, one message remained clearest. The last enemy that shall be destroyed is death. Harry stood silently before the ruin. Not as the boy who lived. Not as the chosen one. But simply, as a son. Ginny held his hand. James, Albus, and Lily Luna watched without fully understanding. But Harry did. This was where everything had ended, and everything had begun. Inside the cottage, its walls now preserved by spell and museum stewardship, time remained still. The crib was gone, but the floorboard still carried the marks of Lily's final protection sigils. The hall still bore the splinter where James had stood his ground. The nursery window faced east, where the sun still rose each morning like it always had, even when they didn't. Harry stepped into the room alone. He bent, placed a hand on the floor, and for a moment, just listened. There were no ghosts here. Just memory. And love. In the years following Voldemort's fall, Harry made no great claims to heritage or honor. He accepted no titles beyond those earned in service. He worked to mend, not to reign. His greatest legacy was not defeating a Dark Lord, it was raising children who knew why their names mattered, and why sometimes, history must be carried not in stone, but in silence. The cloak, still flawless after centuries, remained in a chest in the Potter household. One day, it would pass to James, or perhaps Albus. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder of choice, of humility, of the power of walking unseen, not to escape, but to protect. And so, full circle, the legacy stood. The Potters had never ruled the world. But they had changed it. Not with crowns, but with kindness. Not with fear, but with sacrifice. Not with conquest, but with compassion passed down, one generation at a time. They had endured prejudice, war, betrayal, loss. But they had never stopped choosing what was right, even when the cost was everything. Harry Potter, the child marked by prophecy, raised in shadow, bearer of the Hallows, had not become a god. He had become a man who understood his family. And through him, through his children, and through the stories told beside fireplaces in quiet homes, the name Potter would remain. Not just remembered. Lived. Long after the last war ended, long after the world stopped counting scars and started planting again, the legacy of the Potters settled not in halls of power, but in memory. Not the kind etched into marble, but the kind told in stories, whispered by candlelight, recounted in classrooms, shared across generations not for their glory, but for their meaning. The name Potter had returned to where it began. Quiet. Unassuming. But unbreakable. It began, as many things do, with a man who healed, Linfred of Stinchcombe, whose kindness to neighbors gave rise to magical medicine, who never sought recognition but whose legacy of care would ripple through centuries. It passed through his daughter Iolanthe, who chose love over prestige, linking the family to Ignotus Peverell, the master of the Cloak, and guardian of Death's mercy. It threaded through inventors, activists, protectors, Rolston, Henry, Fleamont, Euphemia, each a quiet pillar, each choosing not dominance, but decency. And then, in one bright and burning generation, it passed to James and Lily, two souls forged in war, who chose to love fiercely even as the shadow rose. They died not as warriors, but as parents, with arms outstretched, with hearts unwilling to yield. And in doing so, they gave the world a son, and to that son, they passed everything. Harry Potter lived not because he was chosen, but because he was loved. He did not win because of prophecy, but because of principle. He wore the cloak not as a shield, but as a choice. He never sought the Elder Wand. He never used the Resurrection Stone for power. He understood what his ancestors had known for generations. That magic without purpose is dangerous. That legacy without love is meaningless. And that the truest power is doing what is right when no one sees you do it. In his twilight years, Harry seldom spoke of the war. He told his children stories about Fred Weasley's pranks, Hermione's fierce loyalty, Ron's courage, and Neville's garden full of mandrakes that never stopped singing. He showed them the cloak, once, when James Sirius asked what it meant to disappear. "It's not for hiding," Harry said. "It's for showing up when others can't see you're there." And that was all. The rest, he left unsaid. Because he knew. The story would live on. In the quiet way Albus read the same books James once loved. In the spark Lily Luna showed when dueling, her stance nearly identical to her grandmother's. In the way the family, on every Halloween, left a candle at the old gate in Godric's Hollow. And so the legacy endured. No longer a tale of war, but a lineage of hope. A line unbroken by death, unmarred by ambition, untouched by ego. A legacy carried in the humblest of items, a cloak. A scar. A name whispered not in fear, but in love. And the world remembered. It always would. Because the Potters had never sought immortality. They had simply chosen to live in such a way that immortality chose them. In the world of magic, there are few names that endure beyond their time, whose echoes drift not just through history books, but through hearts. The name Potter is one of those rare few. But theirs was never a legacy born of conquest or crowns. It was one born of choice. From Linfred of Stinchcombe, brewing his first healing draughts in a garden for neighbors, to Iolanthe, who passed the invisibility cloak to her children with quiet reverence, the Potter family shaped their legacy not with grand proclamations, but with acts of compassion, resistance, and love. They lived through times of peace and times of peril. They stood beside giants, but never above others. They did not chase greatness. They became great by doing what was right. And so the cloak passed down. Not merely as a tool of concealment, but as a symbol of humility, of legacy, of protection without pride. When it came into Harry's hands, the cloak recognized not just a descendant, but a worthy bearer. One who would one day walk into death's arms not for glory, but for others. 1,000 years of purpose, fulfilled in a moment of selfless courage. That is what magic remembers. Not the spells. Not the bloodlines. But the meaning left behind. The story of the Potters may no longer be sung in wizarding ballads or carved on ministry plaques. But it lives in how their name is spoken. In how their children choose to live. In the silence between spells where love takes root. The Potter line has done what few ever do. It has survived history not just by enduring it, but by shaping it for the better. And in that quiet, enduring legacy, the cloak still shimmers. Waiting, perhaps, for another moment in time. Another choice. Another story. But until then, it rests. For the world, thanks to them, has been given a little more time to choose what is good.